with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen real quick. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So I tried to be consistent with my placement of pictures and text. If you're a planner and you don't want to cover the pictures, I'm going to put all the pictures on the right side of the screen. If you're a reader, you don't want to cover, it'll be on the left side of the screen. Thank you again, Jason, for that lovely introduction. Student teacher in the community. I study questions of innovation and education reform at UNC Greeley. And just this morning, I changed my title to A Conscious Nemesis to Subvert the School to Prison Pipeline. Now my slides aren't going to, there they go. So I started with this question of what are the historical and modern commonalities between the education and incarceration systems here in the United States. And this came out of a lecture. I had a teacher that was just like, so much information came out, and this was one sentence in an hour and a half, and it was really fast. So I wanted to look further into it, and this is the sum total of what I found, and it is just a skim on the top of this topic. So I want to ground us in something called space and place, and human experience. So humans experience have sensory experiences in place and space. And place is a physical surrounding, and this can be indoors, outdoors, anytime there's some kind of interaction with the physical environment, constructed or natural. And the place shapes the way in which people interact with each other within that location. And then space refers to the pattern of behaviors that occur within that location or that place. The terms are difficult to separate from each other, and Yi-Fu Tuan, whose book I used in this project, he actually uses them interchangeably throughout the book. So keep that in mind when we talk about space and place. Experiences communicate explicitly, implicitly, and what's called null communication. And explicit communications are things that are very apparent. In human communication, we would say these are things that we communicate with words. So for example, men are better suited for leadership positions would be explicit communication. Implicit communication would be what we communicate through our actions and the way that we treat people, the way we engage with people. So for example, if I am a teacher in a classroom and I discipline boys more than girls, that would be an implicit demonstration of who I perceive as troublemakers or criminals. Or another example, if I was to affirm white students more than Latinx students, that says something about my implicit beliefs. The null is what is omitted either on purpose or by accident. And in an education setting, and I would argue in any institutional setting, this is particularly powerful because this is where cultural, racial, and identity erasure occurs. So if I'm teaching history and I begin teaching history with Christopher Columbus, that erases all of the previous human societies that lived in North America. So it's very, very powerful. And then these experiences shape perceptions of ourselves, our role in the community, and our ideas and values for the community. And human structures have changed over time to reflect these societal relationships and how that has changed. So if we zoom way out to a million-year scale, there's been this progression from ephemeral and seasonally mobile dwellings that have relatively disappeared on Earth, that gave way to the agriculture era 10,000 years ago and the industrial era 200 years ago, which has led to relatively sedentary life, and I use that word loosely. So within the societal context, mimesis is a phenomenon that occurs in architecture, and it's conscious or unconscious reproduction of industrial spaces for volume and efficiency, which is our dominant economic ethos, and that trickles out into other institutions as well. And this duplication occurs in places of incarceration and education. And I think about it as it applies to a lot of our workspaces and our community spaces as well. So our pictures on the bottom, we have a school picture on the left, and then on the right, one of these two images is a prison factory and one is a factory. And all three of the images, aesthetically, those settings look very familiar or very similar. So a consequence of this mimesis is isolation. It also, another phenomenon that occurs is there's a construction of a fortress, or surveillance can sometimes happen in these public spaces. And this is symbolic of both internal fears. What are the thoughts that I have that I'm shameful, or who within my own circle am I fearful of for whatever reason? And then also with the fortress comes the idea of we must be fearful from threats that are coming from outside of the community. And Foucault, this is an image of the panopticon. Foucault argues that architecture is a modern demonstration of disciplinary power. He uses prisons as the example, but similar phenomenons exist in schooling as well. So again, school buildings are shaped by these cultural and historical concepts. Security, immigration, terrorism threats are covered a lot in our news media, and architects refer to this as the preemptive threat culture. So there's a presupposition of criminality for either internal or external of our school environments. And what this means for educational architecture is fortress structures. So what is it like when you walk into the building? Are the windows barred? Are there metal detectors and things like that? Once we're in the building, how do the students move through the spaces? Are they monitored? Do they have to check out everything as they go, or are they trusted to protect things? So if we combine these things together, an education setting teaches both, remember, explicitly, implicitly, using space and place. And one of the phenomenons that comes out of this teaching is the school to prison pipeline. And this refers specifically to the disproportionate exposure of students to the criminal justice system while attending schools. And these disparities fall on racial lines. And it's a phenomenon we see across the country and across school districts. There is an entire sector of social science called educational trauma. One of the studies that I read recently interviewed people of color in youth detention centers, and it asked them when they had their first contact with police officers, and 100% of them said it was at school. So I wanted to look at, so that's the summary, the intro, if you will, and then I wanted to look at the ideological foundations, like how did this commonality come to exist? So this is Foucault, and he is associated with kind of prison philosophy and prison practices. And he refers to the human body as docile. It can be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. And the prisons function as like puppets or small scale models of power. And then for schooling, oh no, I moved my window and now it's not working. Oh, there it goes. And this is Edward A. Ross. He was one of the early thinkers in education and what US public schools should look like. And he was very interested in education as a mechanism of social control. And he describes students, children, as little plastic lumps of human dough that he would shape on the social kneading board. He also referred to schools as an economic system of policing. And he is, let's see. And if we look at education from a larger view, it, as it is now, serves as a sorting mechanism for young people as they age and enter the workforce or college institutions, whatever it is that they aspire to do and have access to do. Isabel Wilkerson, I'm reading her book called Caste. She makes the argument that this is also a caste system. The New York Times did a wonderful analysis a couple years ago where you could manipulate different variables like race, class, gender, physical address, and how that would influence where you started financially and where you ended. I highly recommend give that a look. Let's see. Okay, so both these gentlemen held similar beliefs about the utility of these institutions as social control. Ross in particular was notorious for his position on eugenics and commitment to shaping students for the interests of society. And both of these men continue to influence prison and education today. So that's the ideology. Let's look at some architecture. I know when I think about early education, I think of the little, this one-room schoolhouse. And this is kind of nostalgic of the 1800s. And that architecture has basically also disappeared and given rise to these large school buildings with lots of different spaces that students interact with. And it's changed profoundly. And then I think it's also important to note that in the 1800s, although people that were colonizing North America, the one-room schoolhouse may have been their experience, but it was not the experience of indigenous peoples that were had lived on the land. And there was, the removal of children from families as the indigenous peoples were removed from North America or the United States. Also had occurred at this time, and those children were brought to boarding schools, and their education experience was profoundly different. If we're thinking about here in Jefferson County, real and perceived threats influence architecture as well. So again, the fortress is the physical preemptive threat, and then surveillance is like fear of what is inside the community. And I want to acknowledge that here in Jefferson County, the Columbine shooting that occurred has profoundly changed the way that education, or that the school district plans buildings and plans safety. Every single school has a specific plan in order to make sure that mass shootings don't ever happen in Jefferson County again. Surveillance is a little bit less apparent than the fortress school phenomenon. A lot of schools have closed circuit televisions. Some schools, I know a school I used to work at had one. I had a camera in my classroom as well. And then there's like the camera part of it, or the like administration observation, but peer surveillance can also occur. So like, what are the children saying to each other, or what are coworkers saying to each other? How are they interacting? Some cases, peer surveillance can be encouraged. And then also, since we're in the era of the Chromebook, especially now that we're all remote, there can be voluntary or involuntary data collection that happens. And these are all ways that we communicate, I would say implicitly. So we talked about the roots. We talked about some architecture. So what do these two systems have in common in terms of what is their end goal? I am going to take a second to take a sip of water. If you would like to read this, I would appreciate it. I highly recommend Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? This is where this quote comes from. And the last part of the quote is really what I wanted to point out. The ideological work that prisons performs is it relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society. especially racism and increasingly global capitalism. And she not only critiques the prison system, the prison industrial complex, but she puts forth the argument that prisons function purely as a means of obtaining a nearly free labor force for corporations here in the United States. And they are companies that we all shop at daily, or near daily now that we're all in our homes. But I've definitely wondered purchasing some things, been like, how can this possibly be so cheap? And now I know the answer to that question. And that is disproportionately Black men in our country are incarcerated. For education, I cannot remember what thinker said this. Oh, I'm totally having a brain freeze. But they talked about education as a way to deposit workers into this wage labor system. And education functions as just a way to create workers. And this is Paulo Freire on the right. At this time, oh wait, now I remember what I wanted to say. In social science, we ask ideas or what the idea is and how does that function in society. So one of the functions of education, or the hypothesized function of education, is something called the banking model. So students arrive in school as empty vessels, just like ready to be filled with information. And teachers take the information that they have, that they're told to share to the students, and they fill their little empty minds over the course of however long they stay in school. And then they are deposited into democratic society. And many education critiques the purpose that students are only provided enough information to give the illusion of meaningful democratic participation, i.e. Voting and nothing more. Or in particular, voting for the presidential election and nothing more. Education fails to provide the critical skills to transform the oppressive systems that students exist within. Gains have, I should say, a lot of gains have been made in this respect, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And at this time, I want to point out we have identified what space and place is and how that influences experience. We have talked about education in prisons' ideological roots. We talked about architecture, and then the capitalist ends. At this time, before we switch to pure education, are there any questions? And I can't see any of you, so. Okay, I'm just gonna keep going.
I don't see any in the chat, so keep going.
Good okay, job. Cool, thank you. I can only see 2 screens. So what this looks like specifically in the education setting, or I should say both the punitive behavior management shows up in both schools and prisons, and it can define the relationships between administrators and teachers and students, or teachers on teachers, and obviously between prison employees and people that are incarcerated. And the end result of this is the disobedience results in an isolation from the larger community. And the power of inclusion in the community, or exclusion, is held solely by the authoritarian in this case. So space and place, again, act together to teach, right, authority. Humans are a social species, so exclusion is the worst case scenario, even for the most introverted among us, like myself. Exclusion is deeply harmful, and even more so for young, developing children. So what do these look like in the school setting? These are simple things like putting a student out in the hallway, or sending the student or referring them for in-school suspension, or just otherwise excluding them from your classroom. And that can lead to exclusion from the school community through out-of-school suspension or expulsion. The problem in discipline is when the discipline is very subjective. Teachers have very different thresholds for what they perceive for different behaviors. And this is specifically harmful in our work if a teacher has racialized perceptions. So if they come in with the assumption that certain students are a threat, or there is an assumption of criminality already in place about that student because of their race, it can contribute to how the teacher interacts and disciplines the student. And obviously that would be inequitable. If zero tolerance policies are particularly harmful for students because it doesn't give them the opportunity to resolve conflict or resolve the harm or whatever it was that happened. There's intense competition among students that can lead to exclusion. Some communities really prioritize compliance and working hard over mental health and things like that. This image on the right is really common to see in professional development. So authoritarian would be on the upper left. So there's really high control and a complete absence of support. So this is like, you will do XYZ and you will not question, and you will sit and you will do. And the student might be asking for help and the teacher's like, nope, you just sit and you figure it out. In the perfect world, a teacher would be on the right. And that would be high control facilitated through high expectations and then high levels of support. So we hold high expectations and then we scaffold the student up so that they can meet the expectations. I want to get the wording right, so that they become conscious of their own competency. The students are competent when they show up in our classroom, and it's more of revealing to them the power and the skills that they already have. Okay, so the schools prison pipeline again refers to the disproportionality of discipline based on race. Black students are 3 times more likely, and Latinx students are 1.5 times more likely to be subjected to exclusion than their white counterparts. The American Psychological Association find exclusive school policies increase dropout rates and fosters ongoing contact with the criminal justice system. And this image shows it as a path, but it's not, once we start on the path, it's not inevitable that we go all the way to the end. There is data, right? The data supports that there is a tendency for students to stay in this path, but there are interventions at each of these steps that could prevent further movement on the path. So what this would look like specifically would be if, a student is, hungry and tired and they're crabby, and because they're in middle school, they don't know how to say, I'm hungry and I'm tired and I don't want to work. They'll just start acting out, or they throw a pencil or something. And a teacher perceives that as disruptive. So they write a referral, and that goes down to the administrators, and the administrators come up with a consequence for that. If it's a small offense like throwing a pencil, right, we might have an in-school suspension. And so once that is in the system, sometimes teachers will identify that student as a serial disruptor, and then they would continue to refer them for, could be minor infractions. And that could lead to expulsion. And it's super important when a student leaves the community that they are integrated and welcomed back into the community, regardless of whatever harm that had happened. And if that isn't done in a good way, there can be school failure, dropout is possible, juvenile incarceration, and that tends to lead to adult prison as well. So where are we at as a school district? I just looked at a couple different disciplines. So if we assume that all students, regardless of race, are subject to the same disciplinary actions from their teachers and administrators, we would see a perfectly straight line. We see that we do not have a perfectly straight line. If there is more red, that means there's an overrepresentation of that group. And if there's more blue, there is an underrepresentation. So Asian students are less likely to receive an out of school suspension than their white counterparts, and less so than Black students. And we see similar trends in the other levels. This graph on the bottom right takes out it's corrected for the duplicate students, so that students that I would say receive discipline more often, the duplicates have been removed. And if we look on the state level, the line is more central. So I'll go back real fast. That's Jeffco. This is the entire state. And the state has been doing a lot to reduce student contact to police officers over the last 4 years, I think, was when the work really started to get to hit the ground running. So how do we transform the school to prison pipeline? Same image, but different. There's different things in each of the circles. So the atmosphere starts in the classroom. A culturally responsive atmosphere that draws from the community of students is the first step, and it's cultivated by classroom teachers. So what that asks teachers to do is look at their content and then know their students, and then make sure that the student interest, student culture, and student identity in all of its beautiful forms is compatible, or they see themselves in the content that they are learning. And that can take so many different forms. Collaborative school culture is led by school administrators to foster student-centered curriculum that elevates discourse and inquiry. Through that process, students develop their own expertise and are empowered by authentic engagement within their inclusive community. Schools that offer opportunities for anti-racist and collaborative cultures are more likely to graduate students, subverting the school to prison pipeline. And then after young people enter or leave school, is there the possibility for jobs with a living wage? What is healthcare? Are they able to get their needs met? That is also a huge part of subverting the school to prison pipeline. So the sum total of all my findings: space and place act synergistically to teach power and discipline. US education and incarceration systems have a long history of disparities that fall on racial lines. The causes and the consequences of the school to prison pipeline are known and predictable. The good news is, because we know them and because we've studied them for so long, we know how to subvert them as well. So following the killing of George Floyd over this past summer and the attention given to aid to abolition, many districts across the country have ended contracts with police officers in their schools. And I would also add the economic instability. What is the number now? Like 8 million people, 9 million people living in poverty. I cannot remember the last number. But that has really revealed the inequity that results from our US version of capitalism. There's very clear political will to reform education, to reform the prison system, social system, economic systems. That's why we're all here. Individual schools play a keystone role in the school to prison pipeline. So this is a large issue, but at the same time, a single school community can make profound differences in this work. And I think it particularly falls on white teachers and white communities to know and unlearn racist behaviors that manifest explicitly, right, with our words, and implicitly with how we behave. And I would say that every single teacher can continue to improve in this work, and I include myself for certain. Teacher training is part of this as well, and the the 4 professional developments that are, it's like a suite that subverts the school to prison pipeline is implicit bias, trauma-informed practices, and then restorative justice or restorative practices, which teaches young people how to navigate conflict, which is inevitable in life, and then culturally responsive pedagogy. I will say that teacher training and district professional development are a means to transform classroom practices, but alone is inadequate in systemic reform. Administrators have a role in this as well. They are able to build or not build collaborative communities. They have power in ending punitive behavior management. Policymakers can distribute more funding to education to fund mental health services, social programs, and increase access to economic stability for all people, and specifically prioritizing communities of color. And then we also talked about agriculture or architecture. So I want to add, my proposal is that we add a conscious mimesis to education reformation, thinking about architecture. So we act on the intent to create safe spaces for students of color, and we also include places, right? How are we constructing our environments? What do the buildings look like? What is it like to move through them? How does it feel? We'll also, right, it acts synergistically to encourage students to attend school. So if we look at our little picture on the bottom right, we have a square, and there is a position of privilege would be the gray square in there. And I am totally guilty of setting my classroom up like this, where I am in the front, and that is where I stand when I talk. And it's a position of privilege where I am the knowledge holder and the students are the receivers, right? That's asymmetrical. It communicates power. So the alternative to this is symmetrical and circular spaces, natural light, create welcoming and comforting experiences. Education system is, right, philosophically, it's an architect and a mirror of society, and they education and society co-construct each other in space and place. And a conscious mimesis will cultivate deliberately inclusive places that hold space for community relationships in an education setting. And with that, I have my references if you are so inclined. And I would love to have questions.
That was awesome, Mandi.
Thank you.
Wow. We had a couple questions in the chat that I might just read out. One was from Dawn. During teacher education, I still heard the idea in 2002 that a teacher should not smile until after Thanksgiving. Doing so might lead to lack of control. Is that still a thing?
That is absolutely still a thing. My mentor teacher told me that, what was that, 6 years ago? Yep, that's still a thing, but it's